Sago, I'm Dale Montour. Aboriginal people have always been the keepers of the land. Their philosophy of life is to live in harmony with all living things. When they hunted, they gave thanks to the animals, and they never killed more than they could use. There was never any waste. Aboriginal trappers today continue to hunt off the land, and they still do it while living in harmony with nature. George Tanasi used to be one of those men, and he has many stories to tell. We spoke to George in North Bay, Ontario. This is Lake Nipissing and the home of the Nipissing Band. George and his family have been here for generations, and like his father and his father's father, George and his many brothers made their living by trapping and living off the land.
I went with my brother, and he was there before, the year before, with another partner he had. And he said, we'll get there on midnight. I don't know, just break the daylight or left. And we made good time. Snowshoeing was good, and we had a toboggan. We had 3 dogs. Big long toboggan. We go in October, 1st of October. And we look for a place where we're going to make the cabin. We don't take anything. You just make it out that's right from right there in the roofing. The roofing, we split them, and where we really get a hollow log, and like cedar's always hollow. And you split that, and you put it on top. You bring the other ones the other way, the other ones upside down. And you put moss in there, too, not too much, but you block the drainage. It was all right.
Of the 80 to 100,000 trappers in Canada, about half of them are Aboriginal. George and his ancestors are from the snowshoe and dog sled era. But although the tools of the trade may have changed, the importance of the fur trade for these Aboriginal people hasn't. For many, it is the only thing they know, and living off the land in some cases is the only viable economic alternative.
Majority of the people within the community depend on trapping. If you were to cut off trapping, where would they go? They don't have education. They don't have any degrees to fall back on. Where would they go?
We depend all on trapping, hunting, fishing, mostly trapping.
For Native people, the proper relationship between the hunter and his prey was one of respect and reciprocity. You respected animal populations by not taking too many individual animals.
Try to get 2 big ones, 2 big beaver, to lift my traps out. Leave them for the following year. If you clean up, there won't be nothing. There's just a dry pond.
Hunting and trapping for people like George is more than just a way of life. The animals and fish that he and many other trappers harvest are used as their primary sources of nutrition, and the money from the sale of products manufactured from the skins and furs is used to supplement the precarious and fragile economy that exists in most of these northern settlements.
Native people get as much as, in some cases, as little as 70, and in some cases as much as 90% of their household incomes directly from the land. Being on the land allows you to pursue other kinds of activities in addition to the cash crop of fur, right? For instance, if you kill a beaver, well, you've got a pelt that may be worth anywhere from $25 to $100, depending on the market. In addition to that, though, you've got 20 pounds of meat that you can eat. You've got gallbladders that can be used for medicine. You've got castor, which could be sold for perfume, or which could, in fact, be used for other kinds of medicine or for baiting your traps. When you're out going out to your beaver lodge to collect your traps, you might have the possibility of coming across a moose tract, which allows you to go out and to hunt moose. you're in the bush anyway, so you can collect herbs and you can collect plants and other things for medicine and for food. And any damaged fur that you have, or small fur, you might turn into handicrafts. So you can see how that one little beaver that would be valued in the formal economy at $25, all of a sudden assumes a lot more significance, right? It becomes a very much more valuable resource.
Rodney Bobbywash is a historian from Northern Ontario. He's currently working on his PhD at Oxford on the history of the fur trade during the 19th century. He's very aware of the important role Aboriginal people played and are still playing in the fur industry.
I think they played the most significant role in the fur trade. The fur trade was impossible to run without Aboriginal people. I mean, who did you have to collect the fur? In terms of the middlemen in the fur trade, Aboriginal people were always the people in the middle. At first, the Cree were the middlemen to the Ojibwe, and later on the Ojibwe became the middlemen to the Plains people, and then the Plains people become the middlemen to the people in the plateau and the mountain area. When I studied the late 19th century, all the small merchants and petty traders in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Manitoba in the north were all Indians and Métis people. There were very, very few white people up there who were actually working as merchants and traders. Indian people are the engine that drives the fur trade.
George and many other trappers were forced to retire from trapping because of the European boycott on sealskin products and large-scale campaigns against the trapping of fur-bearing animals. A major argument of these anti-fur, anti-seal movements was that animals were being overhunted and many populations were being wiped out.
It doesn't make any sense. If these animals are your bank, right? In the same way that we keep money in a bank, these animals are a bank for Indian people, right? They're not only your bank though, they're your grocery store, they're your pharmacy, they're your clothing store. It makes absolutely no sense at all that Indian people would want to destroy their only means of subsistence.
The environmental movement has gained a lot of momentum over the last decade. Concern for Mother Earth, its plants and animals, has become an industry unto itself. One of the spin-offs of this concern is the animal rights movement. They have been very successful in their campaigns to stop the killing of animals for commercial purposes. Unfortunately, since Aboriginal people continue to hunt and trap, they have borne the brunt of the animal rights movement. To the animal rights people, hunting and trapping is the senseless killing of animals. To Aboriginal people, it is simply the continuation of a lifestyle that has lasted for generations. What kind of impact has the animal rights movement had on Aboriginal hunters and trappers and their economy lifestyle?
It's had a very serious impact. There's a number of things that have happened. Of course, in the 70s, there was the Greenpeace blockade of the sealing industry. Excuse me. And that hit particularly the Western Arctic communities very hard. In those communities, prior to, say, 1976, when the sealing ban comes into effect, there's nobody in those communities on welfare. There are no unemployed people in those communities. Within a couple of years, by 4 years, say 1980, and you got to remember the bottom drops out of the seal market entirely. It's gone. It's there one day. It's not there the next day. That's the way this works. Because the European Parliament bans imports of sealskins. And those communities overnight see 90% welfare rates. They see 90% unemployment rates in their communities. They see their suicide rates increase by 5 or 6 times at this point. Their juvenile delinquency rates go up. If you can't go out in the land, if you have no reason to go on the land, and your only option is to bury the seals that you do catch, in a landfill somewhere, that's obviously going to impact your life in a very traumatic fashion.
Indeed, it would seem that the consequences of prolonged boycotts of sea mammal products and the effects of the anti-fur lobby will spell disaster for the people of the Northwest Territories and other northern communities. Well, can't the Aboriginal people that are involved in the fur industry turn to other jobs or other means of supporting themselves?
I guess you could if you wanted to move to Toronto, but we all know that with what the unemployment rate in Toronto is, where are they going to go for jobs? Besides which, they already face the lowest literacy rate in the country. They already face a whole set of social circumstances which is compounded exponentially compared to any other community in the country.
I felt it was time to meet somebody from the anti-fur movement to find out what their perspective of the fur industry was and where it had come from. So I paid a visit to Anne Doncaster at her home in Mississauga, Ontario. She is the director of the Canadian tier of the International Wildlife Coalition, which started in the mid-1980s. What are the goals of the organization?
To put it simply, I guess, our objectives are to prevent cruelty to wildlife, to prevent the killing of wildlife, and to prevent the destruction of wildlife habitat. I think the general approach is that we identify, or someone identifies, a problem pertaining to wildlife, obviously, because that's what we specialize in. We try to research the subject, see what the problems are, then develop a campaign to try to end it if we think we have a hope of winning, and always knowing it'll be long term, and then we try to work out the strategies and campaigns to stop the practice and change the political policy.
So one of the issues then you work on is the commercial fur trade, which the organization and the people associated with are against.
That's correct.
And why are you against the commercial fur trade industry?
Well, if you look at our objectives, it is to prevent cruelty to wildlife, and in our opinion, there is a great deal of cruelty involved in the fur trade, both the trapping end and the ranching end of it, and to prevent the killing of wildlife. Well, obviously, millions of animals end up dead as a result of the commercial fur trade, so for both reasons, we oppose it.
How did you go about launching a campaign against the fur trade industry?
It was really something that simply emerged from the anti-sealing campaign. Harp seals were killed basically for their fur, or hair, being hair seals. And that was all part of the fur trade as far as we were concerned. And I think it was clear from the beginning that it was all part of the same thing, and that once the seal hunt was more or less under control, and it's not ended yet, the commercial seal hunt, that it would be natural to evolve into the whole fur issue. Although the fur issue has just taken a high profile really in the last 3 or 4 years, the animal rights movement has always been against it. The reason I got into what I'm doing now 14 years ago was because of the fur industry. It's just that somehow times seem to be right. Attitudes change. And when that happens, it gives a momentum to a movement.
The animal rights people are against the killing of any animal for whatever purpose. And so Aboriginal people, I guess, are being viewed by some people as just going out there simply killing the animal and just taking it for its pelt. And, of course, buying luxury items or whatever the case may be. That is not the case?
That's wrong. And Native people tend to use everything that they can, and they tend to, when they kill animals, to respect them. I mean, they're tied into a whole cosmology and a whole worldview which sees animal life as being more important than human life. In the Ojibwe and Cree culture, human beings are at the bottom of the totem pole. They're not at the top, right? The animals and the animal masters, the Puwaganak and the Stabio, are much, much higher. I think an interesting view of this was one that a friend of mine, Alex Mackay, who teaches Ojibwe language here in town, and who's grew up in the trap line, worked many years of his life in the trap line, gave, and he talked about when you buy a hamburger in town here. Now, if you buy a hamburger in town, you go to a store which has been, built with bricks and mortar and all the stuff that's come out of the earth to do that. You produce garbage because you have all the waste that's come from that meat. The cow that's made that hamburger has eaten how many tons of grain in its lifetime to produce that amount of beef. The fertilizer that's gone to grow that has ended up back in the river and the land again, polluting the land. there's an immense amount of waste involved in eating that one hamburger, right? On the land, you eat a moose burger. That moose is roam free all his life, doing whatever he does. He's happy, you kill him, you use everything that comes from him. There's no waste involved at all.
I wondered what other kind of research the animal rights movement had done with regard to the fur industry. So far on my own, I had found out that the hunters and trappers do in no way destroy wildlife habitat when hunting or trapping. I found out that trappers do not overhunt. Further research told me that no endangered species are hunted at all, and in fact, there are more fur-bearing animals in Canada than there have ever been. That Canada is the undisputed world leader in humane trapping research and has invested over $3 million for this work. And that certain species were becoming overpopulated and disease was spreading rapidly amongst them. So I asked Anne if her group had visited with any Aboriginal trappers or had at least done some research on their way of life.
Yes, we did look into it, and interesting you should mention that, because the reason we did so was very specific in terms of looking at the native issue. The government produced 2 reports, the Department of Indian Affairs, one of them, and Department of External Affairs, another. These documents were leaked to us, and they talked about the government's strategy for dealing with the anti-fur protests. Now, in those documents, which I found profoundly shocking as a Canadian living in a democratic society, the government tried, and using a very expensive American PR firm, to develop a strategy for dealing with the animal rights or the animal welfare movement. One of the things that they said was that they would try to discredit us. Now, that's nothing new. They did the same thing in the seal hunt. Another thing they suggested as one of the recommendations is perhaps they would use the native people as the central defense of the fur trade.
So the International Wildlife Coalition came up with their own strategy to counter that of the government. Anne Doncaster submitted a paper to the Standing Committee on Indian Affairs and Northern Development entitled Native People of Canada and the Fur Trade. Nowhere in the paper was there any reference to the current situation of Aboriginal trappers. It was based solely on the past.
My particular concern and assignment was to deal with the fact that the European culture and some parts of the Canadian culture had this romantic view of early native lifestyles. Just as in my culture we have a romantic view of ball dresses or going back farther, a more rural society where life is simpler, life was beautiful, and so on. This is human nature. I think it's more or less cross-cultural, that we look to the past and we romanticize it. So we're thinking, okay, what is going to happen? The native issue will emerge, and it will draw sympathy from the point of view that people do romanticize certain things in the past. We look back and remember the good. We remember the funny things. We don't tend to remember that life was very, very hard in the past, and it's very, very hard today.
What do you think, after reading through her paper, what did you think the point of the paper was?
The point of the paper was to advance an animal rights agenda, and in the process to denigrate Native people and Native culture, so that we would not be in a position then to interfere with their agenda. The paper is not targeting the fur industry as much as the paper targets Native people.
The fact is that Native people in the international fur market play a very, very small part. It's important to them, obviously, just as it is to the white trapper in Canada or the fur rancher in Europe. To each individual it's important, but the native role is very, very small. It practically doesn't exist in the United States, which produces 5-6 times as many wild furs as we do. It doesn't exist in Europe, which is the center of the ranch raised fur industry. So we would not allow a small segment of people to excuse and justify the mass slaughter of wildlife for the fashion industry.
Seems like a very insignificant thing from their point of view, because they say if you were to add up all of the proceeds from the fur industry, you find a very, very small percentage, about 2%, that would go to maybe as high as 5%, you know, if they're being generous. That would go back to the Native community. And they're right. That all goes back to the Native community. But as I said before, for the Native communities themselves, that 5% represents perhaps as much as 90% of their household income. Maybe 70%, but still the majority of their household income. So yeah, they've very definitely not just hurt, they're destroying Aboriginal people with this campaign.
It's been described, you know, from other people that it's extremely racist in the view which you present here.
I think that word racist is getting thrown around to the point where it's almost discreditable to use it. I feel that it is used to intimidate and shut people up. We live in a democratic society, and I think that is intolerable. I certainly have a very different point of view from those who support the fur trade and those who support killing animals in large commercial industries. There is a conflict. There is a conflict between our organization and those people who kill animals for fur.
But she said she was just, probably to a large extent, quoting what other people were saying.
Well, she might put it in quotation marks, but the way that you arrange your quotations and the kind of uncritical use of quotes, as well as the selective use of quotes, that you use certain quotes but you don't use other quotes, advances a thesis, right? I mean, anyone who's written a paper knows, you know, that you select what you want to say. If indeed she wanted to present a balanced view, then why didn't she go to Eleanor Leacock? Why didn't she go to Charlie Bishop's work, or to Conrad Heidenreich, or to Shepard Kretsch, or Robert Jarvis, any of the, or Jennifer Brown, or Sylvia Van Kirk for that matter? Why didn't she go to any of the more current fur trade historians who are recognized as authorities in the field?
I think they're defending their position, and that's absolutely the Aboriginals' right to do that. It is my right to defend animals. That's what I do. So their perspective is obviously very different from mine. And what is going on now is the public debate, and in the final analysis, it is absolutely right to me in a democratic society that the public will make the final decision.
Ann Doncaster's article is currently being investigated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission with a view to lay charges under the hate literature provision of the Human Rights Code. That's our program for this week. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dale Montour. Onigiwahi, Zego de Dese.